Hi, my name is Alec Powell, and I'm going to be talking about the Tenant of WIldfell by Anne Bronte. But first, we're just going to take a quick look just at her life, what she kind of accomplished, what she did, what happened to her. So she was born in 1820, and she died in 1849 of tuberculosis. But after she was born in 1821, her mother died. And then in 1825, her older sisters, Elizabeth and Maria, both died. And then in 1837, Anne got sick, and then she kind of suffered from a religious crisis, which makes sense because her whole family just keeps getting sick and dying, so it just kind of scares her. And then in 1839, she becomes a governess or a tutor to a family. And then in 1841, Anne herself, and then Charlotte and Emily, they plan to start a school, and it doesn't really work out. So then in 1846, some of their poems are published, and they're published under male pseudonyms with the last name Bell. And then in 1847, Anne's first novel is published called Agnes Grey. And then in 1848, her second novel, The Tenant of WIldfell, is published. And also in that same year, Emily, her sister, and her brother Branwell both die, and then a year later she dies of tuberculosis. So then it's also important just to kind of talk about what's going on during this period. So this is the Victorian period, and then also the Industrial Revolution. So in 1822, The Confession of an English Opium Eater by Thomas De Quincey was published, and although that was really early in her life, it was really important to that time period because there were a lot of addictions happening between alcohol and opium. So then in 1825, the Stockton-Darlington Railway was opened. It was the Industrial Revolution, so there's those railroads being built and other things. In 1829, Patrick Bronte, the Bronte's father, campaigns for the abolition of the death penalty except for murder. In 1830, revolts against despotism, and despotism is just another word for an oppressive government. So there are revolts against an oppressive government in Spain, Portugal, and Italian states. And then also evangelicals, including Patrick Bronte, organized petitions to both houses of parliament for the abolition of slavery. In 1831, Faraday discovers electromagnetic induction. This is the Industrial Revolution. There's electricity and other things like that. In 1833, there's the Shaftesbury Factory Act, which that was just saying that women and children, it kind of limited their hours that they spent working in there. And then also in 1833, the slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. And then in 1834, there was a new poor law, which basically just said that poor people weren't really our problem unless they really needed it. So it was kind of leaving the poor people out. In 1837, Yorkshire campaigns against poor law. Also in 1837, there was the registration of births, deaths, and marriages in England. And then also in 1837, Wheatstone and Cook patent, or they copyright the electric telegraph. And then also during that year, Fox Talbot experiments with photographic prints. And then in 1842, there was the Miners Act, which excluded all children from being in the mines altogether. And then also in 1842, there was the Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population by Edwin Chadwick. And just all together throughout, there's the Shaftesbury Factory Act, and then this, and the New Poor Law and other things. It was just trying to reform society with different things within the family, it seems like. Because a family, the laboring people were typically families, and so it's all about trying to reform the families during this time. So then also in 1845, there was the Lunacy Acts, which was just a bill to, they were going to start building asylums for lunatics to stay in. And then in 1846, there was the Irish potato famine, which was a big thing probably in England since they were so close to Ireland. Okay, so here's the novel summary of The Tenant of WIldfell. So I'm just going to kind of read along, and then I'll talk about it too. So the story begins with Gilbert Markham's point of view. Gilbert meets his neighbor, whose name is Helen. His sister and his mom is really interested in Helen, so he goes over and meets her and stuff. They meet at church. And he doesn't really like her at first because she's cold, and he really likes this other girl named Eliza, who's like really fun to talk to because she just talks about like really light stuff, and Helen's kind of always talking about like almost reform, like she doesn't like alcohol, she wants to raise her kid in a really specific way. But he then begins to like her because she's so honest, but she's also really modest too, which is something that he doesn't see in Eliza. So then Gilbert falls in love with her, but then he sees her with her brother, but he doesn't know that it's her brother, and eventually attacks her brother in a jealous rage. So then Helen wants to explain to Gilbert why she's living there with her brother, and so she gives him her diary so he can read it, and that way she can better explain her behavior to him. So then the story goes from Gilbert's point of view to Helen's point of view as he's reading it. And so then it begins with Helen meeting Mr. Huntington. His name is Arthur. They eventually get married. Even though everyone like tells her like he has this horrible reputation, he's really rude, he's a jerk, like you shouldn't marry him, but she does anyway, and she soon finds out that he is just a really selfish, and he's really manipulative, and he's an alcoholic. And Huntington will spend months away at a time drinking and partying, and when he comes home, he's just even more rude because he's like hungover and probably detoxing from all the alcohol that he's had. And she later finds out that he's having an affair with one of her friends, you could say. They kind of were in the same society before she got married. So once his drinking and behavior gets out of hand, she then takes her son away. And the main reason she wanted to take her son away was because her son was beginning to act like his father, and she wanted to protect him from those habits. So then, with the help of her brother, she goes to WIldfell Hall, where she grew up when she was little. So then the story goes back to Gilbert, who loves her and wants to be with her, and is even though Helen has had such a bad past, he loves her even more for being honest, and now he understands that she wasn't like in love with her brother or whatever. But Helen doesn't want a relationship because she's still a married woman. And she still wants to, uphold her word and her vow that she gave to Arthur when they got married, even though he's been horrible to her. So she plans on leaving because she knows that they cannot be together. Mr. Huntington gets sick, and she goes to care for him. And Gilbert knows, what's going on between Helen and Mr. Huntington now that she's gone back to him, because her brother is showing Gilbert letters that she's written to him. So Mr. Huntington actually ends up dying, and then Helen ends up marrying Gilbert, and that's the end of the story. So just a quick analysis that I thought was a major thing. It's all about reform, and definitely looking at the main events. Patrick Bronte was really into abolishing slavery and was against the death penalty. Like, he wanted to reform society too, so it's just natural for his daughters to try to take up that kind of legacy, and you can see that in Emily Bronte's and Charlotte Bronte's, and then also in Anne's. So my thesis for my paper that I'm going to be writing about the Tenant of WIldfell Hall is Anne Bronte uses the marriage of the Huntingtons, the Lilburrows, and the Hattersleys in the Tenant of WIldfell Hall to overall critique the gender role of men and women during the Victorian society. So Helen and Mr. Huntington, they're the main characters. Technically, Helen is our protagonist in the story. So Mr. Huntington, her husband, is abusive and manipulative, but her wife tries to love him and be a good wife anyway. So she tries to get her husband to stop drinking, and eventually runs away to protect their son from his wicked behavior. And one thing that was really popular was that husbands were supposed to be the leaders of the house, and just constantly trying to give the husband control is just too much, and you can see that within Helen and Mr. Huntington's marriage. Then there's the Lilburrows, which is Annabella and Mr. Lilburrow. So Lilburrow actually marries Annabella. He's a part of the Huntington kind of crowd with the drinking and the gambling and adultery and stuff, but he says he doesn't want to drink anymore, and he turns away from it, and so then he marries Annabella. And he just completely worships her. He thinks she's like this goddess, but secretly his wife is just disgusted with her husband. Annabella is, and her husband doesn't want to drink, but she wants him to drink so that way he wouldn't be around her as much. So that kind of hurts him. Well, her husband actually ends up leaving and takes the children because she ends up having an affair with Mr. Huntington, actually. And so in this situation, you can see that the wife has too much control, because it was interesting during this time period, the man was supposed to be the leader and the women were supposed to have no say. But then there was also like this other side where women were just completely worshipped and idolized, and sometimes they were given too much power. And you can see that between Annabella and Mr. Loughborough. And then there was Millicent and Mr. Hattersley, which Mr. Hattersley was also a part of Huntington and Mr. Loughborough's. And he was kind of rude to Millicent in a way too, or he was really rude to her. He was just as, he was forceful, but she was just really submissive. She wanted to do what society was telling her to do. She wanted to be a good wife. And he just drinks and parties. And one time he's talking to Helen, and he actually says, I would stop drinking if she told me to, but she's just so submissive, I can't help but just take advantage of her. But Helen just continues to persuade him to just stop drinking, and Helen actually ends up showing Mr. Hattersley some letters that Millicent wrote to her, saying that she's scared of her husband, and she's scared for her husband, and she wishes he would just stop drinking because she just loves him so much. And eventually Mr. Hattersley ends up he stops drinking, and they live happily ever after. So even though it starts out like Millicent's super submissive and Mr. Hattersley is super forceful, it eventually evens out to like this equal amount of control. So just looking at those three marriages, you can just see not only the results of the pressures that were put on men and women from the Victorian period, but then also what happens when you have a team effort rather than one has too much control over the other. So.